Hi everyone, this is the video that I promised filming and uploading related to evidence-based practice, specifically how to conduct an appropriate literature review and interventions and how to assess it. Because I think I realized based on the homework on evidence-based practice discussion board post that the majority of the students did not really get what I was going after. So that doesn't mean there's something wrong on your part. It means that probably it's a skill that you either haven't learned yet or that it didn't stick in your research class. So I guess I'm wondering how many of you have taken a research course, particularly those of you that are in the accelerated program, which I think it's the majority of the students that are enrolled in this course. So I think that would be great in helping me also assess your final exam, because then I can be realistic in terms of what you will be able to achieve, and I will not be grading you unfairly thinking that you have had exposure to research methods. So if you could just either maybe in the discussion board post that I leave for like student questions, I'm going to ask you to just please share, whoever wants to share, if they've had any exposure to research methods before, and how knowledgeable they are on research methods. This is not required, it's just voluntary so that I get an idea of how many students need additional support in that department. So just to help you, because I think one of the components in the final examination will be assessing the literature for appropriate interventions to use with the case study that I presented. So I know I shared with you, I think it was one or two sample case formulations, which you can find. Let me tell you, because I have it. Yeah, under the discussion, I'm sorry, under the course materials, you click on it, and then on the little yellow file folders, you scroll down all the way to case formulation examples. I think I posted maybe two exams of students from a previous semester that I think did really well in terms of the whole exam, but particularly the section that I'm speaking about. So I think it's really important. I'm not looking for a high-end, sophisticated review of the literature because that's not the goal of this course. But I do think it's important that you learn how to assess and evaluate literature, right? So for your particular exam and in general for your practice, when I ask the students to evaluate the evidence, I mean that I want to know a couple of things. First, when you conduct a lit review of the evidence, is because you want to know what kind of intervention would best suit your client, particularly when we are younger clients. So you cannot assume that just because CBT is a gold standard for many mental health disorders, we cannot assume that it will be appropriate for all our clients. And why is this? Because of some of the things that I kind of wrote in that discussion board post instructions description. A lot of the studies that we have access to have been conducted in sanitized settings like a clinic or a hospital or a school, and not necessarily in a community or in the households or in a setting that's more natural for children. Schools can be also natural setting, but most of those studies are conducted in clinics or in laboratories or in hospitals. And the problem with that is that that's not a natural setting where children and families kind of like do their most of their day-to-day activity. So there's sort of bias implied in those studies. And usually we know that the samples of a study in terms of the ethnic, racial, age composition vary widely. So you have to see, if I'm telling you that the child in the case study has a depression disorder and the author suggests CBT, what I wanted the students to do was sort of like maybe choose one or two articles and evaluate whether that article or not, which is the evidence, was not appropriate for, or kind of like, in fact, provides further evidence that CBT is indeed the appropriate choice to take, or in the case of selective mutism, um, child parent interaction was the appropriate treatment to do, or some other combination of group and individual um, therapies. So I was kind of looking forward to student telling me a little bit more about the evidence per se, like for example, telling me a little bit more about the article in terms of just assessing what is the population that the article used, or the two articles that you chose. Um, was it a good sampling? Like, was it limited in terms of, was it a small sample size? Was it a large sample size? Were they randomly selected or not? Just to talk to me a little bit about the science of the article, because that's how you also decide whether or not is it's good evidence, right? And you need that, maybe not for cases like depression and anxiety, but for certainly for mental health disorders that might not be as common in children and adolescents. For example, some of the personality disorders, or early onset schizophrenia, which is not very common, bipolar disorder. But that doesn't mean that a client of yours might not be in an early stage and might not meet some criteria. And it's important to kind of assess what evidence is out there, because we want to know, we want to give our client the best possible intervention. So if you assume, let's say for example, oh, because the literature says that CBT is kind of like the gold standard, if you go with that mentality, then you will just apply CBT as it is, and you will not kind of search the evidence or the literature to see, okay, I'm dealing with an African American client, I'm dealing with a Latino client, I'm dealing with a client from India, I'm dealing with a client from Pakistan, from Russia, from wherever the client comes. You gotta see if there's literature out there for other diverse populations. Have this intervention that I am kind of suggesting is good for my client, has it been tried with my population of interest, or the population that is represented in the case study? As in, for example, a 14-year-old Dominican girl with lives in a single household. You want to search for studies, or you want to see if there are studies available that kind of address those variables, right? Like age, ethnicity, single versus kind of nuclear, single versus married parents, nuclear versus adopted versus foster care. You want to kind of search what's out there. In summary, you want to search what's out there for your specific client, right? You want to kind of assess what's available for the client that it's being presented in the case study. So maybe the study that you chose, it's was done in a in kind of like southwestern state with only white population middle schoolers. And when you see your client reflected in a case study, your client is not southwestern, it's of Latino descent, is not in the age range the study proposed. So I think if I may give you a tip or a suggestion, one nice way to kind of assess what's out there in a more global manner is finding either systematic reviews, meta analyses, or scoping reviews. Again, systematic analysis, meta analysis, or scoping reviews, because those are articles that kind of summarize and evaluate rigorously and scientifically the evidence that is available within a specific topic. So, for example, you might want to do a search meta analysis or systematic reviews on anxiety disorders African Americans, or anxiety disorders ethnicities, anxiety disorder gender differences. Um, I think that's the best tip that I can give you to kind of help you stay focused for the final exam, and also do it in a fast and concise and good way. If I may suggest, it's okay if you find other articles, but to help you conduct a better search, because sometimes in those systematic reviews, meta-analysis, scoping reviews, they also present tables kind of summarizing the methods, the sample used, the results, the title of the article. So it's also a great way for you to kind of assess a lot of literature within one single article. So keep that in mind for your final exam, because in your final exam, I do ask students to kind of select an intervention based on the best available evidence. So it's a little bit similar to what you did in the discussion board post for depression and anxiety disorders. But in this case, I'm just asking, okay, so you have a client that's kind of described in the examination case study. And what I want you to do is look for the evidence that's out there that kind of relates best to the client's diagnosis. And remember, you guys are formulating the diagnosis. So if you tell me, Professor Diana, my client meets criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder or bipolar disorder, I think that's the main diagnosis. I would want to see literature. I would want to see an intervention that targets bipolar disorder or post-traumatic stress disorder or one of the anxiety disorders. I would want to see an intervention targeted toward that. So the evidence that I want to see is to support or kind of, yeah, to kind of support, yes, that intervention that you choose. So if you diagnose your client with bipolar disorder as a main diagnosis in Axis 1, so I want you to choose an intervention that has been used with bipolar disorders in adolescents or children. And I want you to find evidence out there that supports that. For example, if your client is Latino or African American, is a middle schooler, or a child in grade school level, what I want you to do is sort of kind of tell me, see, I found there's evidence available specifically for my type of client population. There's evidence out there about this intervention being performed with middle school African American kids, Colombian kids, Mexican kids, Puerto Rican kids, Russian kids. If there's no evidence, that is absolutely fine. But I want you to go to the process of finding it. And then just if there's no evidence available or strong evidence available, well, that's also a critique that you can do, right? I searched for the literature. These are the kind of main articles that I found, but I didn't find strong evidence behind the intervention that I chose. However, I think it's appropriate because A, B, C, and D. But I think it's really critical because a lot of the times we jump in our own practices, we jump into choosing specific interventions, and we don't realize that they may or may not be appropriate. So even if the science says is a gold standard intervention like CBT, sometimes we gotta make variations because not all clients are the same, right? And in order for you to assess what is the best component, you need to read about that intervention, and you need to read what's being done with that intervention in terms of diverse populations, in terms of gender, age, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic background, geographical location. Those are important variables to consider when determining if a manuscript is appropriate or not for the kind of intervention that we want to do. So I don't know if I'm making a lot of sense. I hope I do so. I just wanted to explain it in a simple way what I was going behind. So I want a little bit more of meat and substance in terms of the actual evidence that you found. I believe, I'm actually pretty sure, I put the number of either in the instructions or in the how do you call that, in the kind of scoring sheet that I provided you, I am 99% sure that I wrote the number of references. There are not a lot of references that you need. I think I put like 3 or 4 references maximum. But what I want you to do is just to kind of critique a little bit more those references, right? Give me a little bit of more substance. For example, like I said, I think this article is appropriate and it supports my intervention choice because A, B, C, and D, and this is how it relates to the client described in the case study. Or even though I found some articles, I don't think they are good enough, solid enough to support the evidence. But however, I will decide to stick with this intervention because A, B, and C. So that's all I really want. And for that, again, in a summary, search for the literature that is related to the diagnosis that you gave the child. So if it's bipolar or depression, search for literature, intervention literature that kind of lets you know what are the interventions that are out there for depression in teens, anxiety in teens. And then based on the articles that you find, just tell me, okay, based on the articles, I think there's enough evidence to support this intervention. And I think the evidence also addresses some of the attributes and characteristics of my client. For example, if it's a diverse racial or ethnic group, or if it's age, or if it's gender, just give me a little bit of meat and substance. So if there's something that, and again, remember, systematic reviews, scoping reviews, and meta-analyses, I think are the best searches that you can do because they summarize a bunch of literature within one article. So I would encourage you to start first with those articles. If you have any further questions, do not hesitate to email me or call me because I want you to do well in the exam, and I thought it was important to kind of clarify this. And also for your general practice, it's good to know what's out there so that you can tweak and tailor your intervention according to your client needs. It gets more complicated, obviously, with this diagnosis that are not as frequent in children and adolescents. So that's why it's important to search the literature more in depth. So I hope that's been really helpful, and just shoot me an email or call me with any additional questions. Bye-bye.